He heard the pounding on the door before dawn, the cold air rushing in as he opened it, to see the neighbors standing there covered in soot, eyes wide, with a wild fear that made his voice crack as he shouted, "They burned them all." And he stood there for a moment in the doorway, gripping the frame, as the words sank in, as the smell of smoke came on the wind, and he saw the faint glow in the distance, where the village used to be, and he remembered the laughter of the children who played there, remembered the shared meals and the late-night talks by lantern light, when they promised to help each other if the world ever turned dark, and he felt something break inside as the neighbor fell to his knees, coughing and crying, unable to catch his breath as ash fell from his hair like snow, and he pulled him inside and shut the door, and the small house felt even smaller now, as the weight of what had happened pressed against the walls, and he could hear his wife in the kitchen whispering prayers as she clutched the small wooden cross on the wall, as if it could shield them from the truth outside, and he walked to the window and pushed aside the curtain and stared at the glow on the horizon, the glow that should have been the morning sun, but it was not the sun, it was the fire of homes and lives taken by men who came in the night with torches and loud voices, who tore families from sleep and dragged them into the cold, and he thought of the man who gave him bread last winter when the snow was deep and the roads were blocked, thought of the old woman who sang while she swept her porch and always gave the children apples, and he felt something hot in his chest as he turned to the neighbor who was trying to stand again, mumbling, "They came from the forest, they came with fire, and they said nothing, they just burned everything," and he felt his fists clench and unclench as he listened to the words, trying to imagine the screams, the panic, the smoke in the lungs, and the hands reaching out for help that never came, and he walked to the small table in the center of the room and sat down as the neighbor collapsed into the chair across from him, shaking, covered in ash and tears, and he poured him water and watched as it slipped from his hands as he tried to drink, as he coughed and wiped his face with the sleeve of his burned jacket, and he could not find the words to comfort him, because there were no words that could fix what had happened, no words that could bring back the children, or rebuild the homes, or erase the fear that now lived in every breath, and he felt the weight of the promise he once made to protect his neighbors, to protect the innocent, to stand up when the darkness came, and now the darkness had come, and it was not shadows or storms, it was men with fire and weapons and cruel laughter, and he knew that the glow on the horizon was not just the village burning, it was a call, it was a line, drawn in the dirt, and he felt the fear in his stomach, but he also felt the fire rising inside him as he stood from the table and looked at his wife, and then at the neighbor, and then back at the glow on the horizon, and he knew that everything had changed, that dawn would never be the same again, and that it was time to decide if they would hide in fear, or if they would stand and speak back in the only language the world now understood. She found the small shoes near the road, blackened by the flames as she walked through the cold morning air, her breath clouding in front of her as the ash floated down like quiet rain, and she picked them up with shaking hands and turned them over, feeling the burned leather and the scorched fabric, and she closed her eyes for a moment, seeing the child who once wore them, seeing the small feet that ran across the grass, chasing after the chickens, laughing as the sun fell on their hair, and she felt something sharp break in her chest as she held the shoes against her coat, the air still thick with smoke, as she stepped carefully around the pieces of what was left of the village. The charred wood, the twisted metal, the quiet that was too loud, and she saw the people moving like ghosts, picking through the remains, looking for anything they could save, a pot, a cup, a memory, anything that would remind them that they were still alive. And she saw the mother sitting near what was once a door, holding a piece of cloth to her face, rocking back and forth as she whispered words that made no sound, and she knew that there was nothing she could say to that mother, nothing that could take away the image of flames crawling across the roof of the home where the laughter used to live. And she looked up at the sky that was gray and heavy, and she felt the wind against her face, carrying the scent of burnt wood and loss, and she remembered the way the men came from the forest, how they moved in the dark with their torches, how they threw them into windows, and how they laughed as the fire grew and the screams rose, and she remembered how she hid in the field with her hand over her mouth, watching as the village burned, how she saw the shadows of the people she loved dancing in the flames, and how she wanted to run to them, but she knew she could not. She knew she would only add to the screams, and she remembered how the dawn came with the smell of smoke, and the world felt smaller and darker and colder, and she opened her eyes and looked at the small shoes in her hands, and she knew that she could not forget she could not forgive, and she walked to the place where the people were gathered near the well, the only place that still stood, the stone blackened but unbroken, and she placed the shoes on the ground in front of them, and they all looked at her with tired eyes, with eyes that held the reflection of the fire and the ashes and the screams, and she looked back at them, and she felt the fear in her stomach and the shaking in her hands, but she also felt the fire rising inside her chest, the fire that told her that they could not stay silent, that they could not let this be the end. And she saw the neighbor, who came in the night covered in soot, standing there with the others, his face lined with ash and grief, and she nodded to him, and he nodded back, and in that moment, without words, they understood that the silence had to end, that the fear had to be swallowed, that the fire that destroyed them would become the fire that made them stand. And she turned back to look at the ashes of the village one last time, and she clenched her hands into fists, and she took a breath that tasted of smoke, and she knew it was time to speak back. He remembered how they shared bread with them during the harsh winters, when the roads were nothing but rivers of mud and ice, and the cold crept into the bones of everyone in the village. And he remembered how they came together in the evenings, around small fires, passing bread and thin soup between calloused hands, telling stories that made the children laugh and made the old ones forget the hunger for a moment. He remembered the man who always brought an extra piece of wood for the fire, the woman who mended clothes for the children without asking for payment, the young boy who would carry water from the well for the elders, with a smile even when his own feet were cracked and bleeding. He remembered the way the light of the lanterns flickered against the walls of the small homes, the way they all gathered to share news and to sing softly into the dark, so the fear of the world would not feel so heavy. He remembered the promises they made to each other, that if the darkness ever came they would stand together, that they would protect the children, that they would protect each other no matter what it cost. And he remembered how the darkness did come not as a storm or a flood, but as men with torches and cruel voices who walked through the night with the smell of smoke on their skin and the sound of laughter as they threw fire into homes and pulled people from their beds. And he remembered the screams he heard from the distance, the screams that ripped through the quiet night and shattered the promises they made as the glow of the flames rose into the sky. And he remembered how he stood there in the dark with the cold wind against his face, watching the fire in the distance, while the tears ran down his cheeks, and he felt his hands clench at his sides, unable to move, unable to breathe, as the world he knew was swallowed by smoke. And he remembered how he fell to his knees in the dirt and pressed his forehead against the cold ground, asking for the strength to stand, asking for the courage to keep the promise he made when they all still believed in the morning. And he remembered the way the ground felt beneath him, solid and cold, and he felt the earth speaking to him, reminding him that they were not alone, that they were not weak, that they were not finished. And he lifted his head and wiped the tears and the dirt from his face, and he stood slowly, as the fire still burned in the distance, and he turned toward the house where his wife waited, where the few who survived waited with eyes that held questions and fear. And he knew that he had to answer them not with words, but with action. And he stepped forward with the weight of the promise in his chest, with the memory of the bread they shared and the laughter they protected and the trust they built through years of hard winters and long days of toil. And he knew that they would not let the darkness take everything he knew. They would speak back in the only way the world now understood. And he walked toward the others, with the fire of memory burning in his chest, ready to keep the promise they made long before the flames came. They gathered in the dark barn where the old rifles were hidden, wrapped in blankets, beneath loose boards, covered in dust and memories and fear. They stood close together, breathing in the cold night air that slipped through the cracks in the wood, each of them holding a piece of the promise they made when the world was still whole and the stars were something they could look at without feeling the weight of what was lost. He saw the faces around him, marked by ash and grief, but also marked by something else, something that burned brighter than the lantern they placed on the crate in the center of the room, something that looked like the small flame of hope, mixed with rage, mixed with the memory of the laughter that was stolen from them. He saw the woman holding her child close, the child with eyes that were too old, now eyes that saw the flames that swallowed the neighbors and the homes and the dreams built with tired hands. He saw the young man gripping the handle of the shovel that dug graves in the cold ground when the fire took too many and the ground was too hard. And he saw the elder, who once sang to the children, holding the rifle with shaking hands but with eyes that did not shake as they looked at each the person in that room. And he listened as the silence spoke louder than any words, as each breath they took became a promise to the ashes of the ones they lost and the child who would never wear the small shoes again. He stepped forward and placed the lantern on the ground so the light touched each of their faces, reminding them that they were still here, that they were still alive. And he spoke not with loud words but with the quiet certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. He spoke of the promises they made, the nights they spent helping each other, the food they shared, the laughter they protected, and the children they vowed to keep safe. He spoke of the fire that came in the night and took everything, and he told them that they could not let that fire be the end, that they would carry the fire forward not to burn their own hearts, but to stand for those who could no longer stand for themselves. He saw the nods around the room, the tears that fell silently, the hands that tightened around the tools and the rifles, and the lantern that flickered like a heartbeat in the center of the barn, and he knew they were ready, not because they were strong but because they could not let the darkness grow. Without resistance, he knew they would not let the fear choke them into silence. He picked up one of the rifles and felt the cold metal against his palms, the weight of it grounding him, reminding him of the promise they made and the promise they would keep. He looked at the faces of his people, his family, his neighbors, who became his brothers and sisters through the ashes and the fire, and he nodded once, and they nodded back, and in that moment they all understood that they would speak back to the darkness, that they would rise with the dawn, not as victims but as the fire itself, ready to reclaim what was stolen, ready to defend what remained, ready to remind the world that they were still alive. She looked at her reflection in the river before dawn, as the water moved with the slow quiet of a world that did not know what had been lost, and she saw her face in the ripples, dirt streaked across her cheeks, eyes swollen from smoke and tears, hair tangled and heavy from days without sleep, and she saw the fire in her own eyes, hidden beneath the fear, the trembling in her hands, reminding her of the nights she spent holding her children close, as the screams of neighbors echoed across the fields. She saw the reflection of the trees behind her, the branches broken where men with torches passed through, the leaves still charred where the fire had climbed, and she remembered how she ran with her children through those trees, clutching them against her chest as the glow behind them swallowed the night. She remembered how she fell in the mud, holding her hand over her daughter's mouth so the sound of crying would not bring the men with laughter in their voices and smoke in their hair. She remembered how the cold ground felt against her skin, and the prayers she whispered without words as she waited for the screams to stop and for the night to end. She dipped her hands into the river, feeling the cold water slip across her skin, washing away the ashes, but not the memories, not the fear, not the promise she made as she held her children in the dark, that she would not let the fire take them too. She scooped the water into her mouth, tasting the earth and the cold, letting it fill her lungs as she breathed in and stood straight. For the first time since the fire came, she looked around and saw the others moving quietly near the river, gathering what food was left, what clothes could be carried, what tools could be used to defend what remained. She saw the old man tying rags around the barrels of rifles to keep the rain off the iron. She saw the young boy helping his mother carry a basket of potatoes, each step heavy with the memory of the father they buried beneath the tree where the flames did not reach. She saw the neighbor who once brought her milk when her children were sick, now standing with a shovel in his hand, eyes set on the path that led into the forest where the men came from, and she felt the trembling in her hands, slow as she clenched them into fists as she turned from the river and walked toward the others, her feet steady against the mud, her breath deep and slow as the cold morning air filled her chest. She remembered how she once thought herself weak, how she once believed that fear would swallow her, but now she felt something different. A quiet rage, a steady fire that burned, not to destroy but to protect, to remind her that she was still here, that they were still here, and that they would not let the darkness win. She stood with the others near the edge of the trees, the rifles and tools ready, the children held back by the elders, the fire of memory in their eyes, and she nodded once to the neighbor with the shovel, and he nodded back, and in that silent moment before the dawn, they decided together that they would not run any longer, that they would not hide any longer, that they would walk into the forest not as prey but as the fire, ready to speak back, ready to protect, ready to reclaim what was stolen from them. They moved at night, through the silent forest branches cracking under boots, hearts beating as one, as they followed the narrow path that led deeper into the darkness, where the men with torches once came from. The cold air bit at their faces as they held their breath, listening for sounds that would warn them of danger, each step heavy with the memory of what they lost, each step a promise that they would not stop until the fire that took their homes was answered by the fire in their own hearts. He looked around at the faces near him, the neighbor gripping the old rifle so tight his knuckles turned, White, the young boy who should have been sleeping under warm blankets, clutching a small lantern that barely lit the path. The woman, who once sang to the children holding a knife wrapped in cloth, her eyes sharp and clear despite the tears that still dried on her cheeks. They all moved together in silence as the wind moved through the trees like whispers, reminding them that they were walking towards something they could not run from, reminding them that this forest held the shadows of the men who came in the night. With laughter in their voices and fire in their hands, he felt the weight of the rifle on his shoulder, the cold metal pressing into his skin, grounding him, reminding him that he was not just a farmer anymore, reminding him that he was not just a father or a husband. He was the promise made in the ashes. He was the voice that would not be silenced. He was the fire that would speak back. He looked up and saw the moon cutting through the branches, the pale light falling on the path in pieces, like shattered glass, and he remembered the nights he carried his children through these woods, when they were small, when they would look up at the moon and whisper wishes, when they would laugh softly in the dark, not knowing that the world could burn. He clenched his jaw and kept walking. Each step forward was a step toward the memory of those nights. Each step forward was a step away from fear and into the promise of the fire that now lived inside him. They reached the clearing, where the ground was black with the ashes of old fires, where broken branches still lay scattered, where footprints led deeper into the trees, and they stopped for a moment, standing in a circle, breathing in the cold air as they looked at each other. Without speaking, the neighbor lifted his rifle and checked the barrel. The young boy set the lantern on a rock, so the light would not shake. The woman unwrapped the cloth from the knife and held it against her chest, and he stepped forward, looking at the path that led to the camp where the men who burned their homes slept, where they laughed around stolen food, where they told stories of how easy it was to destroy the weak, and he felt the fear rise in his chest. But it did not drown him this time. It became fuel, it became the fire that would guide his steps, and he turned back to the others and nodded once, and they nodded back, and together they stepped into the dark, moving as one, moving as the fire that would not be silenced, moving as the promise that the ashes would not be the end. End Fire series in cinematic, no punctuation, immersive style. They saw the glow of the campfire before they heard the voices, the low rumble of laughter mixed with the crackle of burning wood as the men who came in the night sat around the flames, with stolen blankets over their shoulders and stolen food in their hands, and the smoke from their fire rose into the cold night sky, carrying with it the scent of stolen lives and broken promises. He crouched behind a fallen tree with the others. Beside him, the woman with the knife, gripping the handle so tight her hand shook. The neighbor with the rifle, checking the chamber with slow, steady breaths. The young boy pressing his hands over his ears to block out the laughter that sounded too much like the laughter he once heard from his father before the fire came. He looked at the faces of those with him, each marked by fear, each marked by the ashes of what they lost, but also marked by the promise they made to the ones who could not stand here with them, and he felt the weight of that promise like a stone in his chest, reminding him that they were not here to run, reminding him that they were here because there was no one else to protect what was left, reminding him that they were the only ones who could speak back to the fire that took everything from them. He moved forward inch by inch through the leaves that whispered beneath his weight, the cold air burning in his lungs as he crawled closer to the edge of the clearing, where he could see the faces of the men around the fire, faces that looked too young to hold so much cruelty, faces that smiled as they spoke of how the flames swallowed the houses, and how the screams echoed in the night. And he felt his hand tighten around the rifle as he pressed his cheek against the cold wood of the stock, the metal cold against his skin, grounding him, reminding him of who he was. Now he looked back at the others, the woman with the knife now beside him, her eyes locked on the men who stole her songs, the neighbor lifting the rifle, slowly aiming with shaking hands but eyes that did not blink, and the young boy holding the lantern low, so the light did not give them away, but so they could see each other, so they could remember they were not alone. And in that moment, as the wind moved through the trees and the smoke from the enemy's fire touched their faces, they all knew it was time. They all knew there was no turning back. They all knew that the fire inside them was ready to speak. And he took a breath that tasted of smoke and earth, and he stood slowly, stepping into the edge of the firelight. The rifle raised, the woman with the knife stepping beside him, the neighbor raising his weapon, the young boy holding the lantern high so the light fell across their faces, so the men around the fire could see them, so they would know that the ones they tried to burn away had returned. And for a moment the laughter stopped, and the world was silent, and he let the fire inside him speak for the first time. The world held its breath in that moment as he stood in the glow of the enemy's fire, the rifle raised, the cold wood pressed against his shoulder, the woman with the knife standing beside him, her eyes like stone, her breath steady. The neighbor, lifting his rifle, his hands no longer shaking as the young boy held the lantern high, the light flickering across their faces and across the faces of the men who once came with torches and laughter, the men who now stared at them with wide eyes. As the fire crackled and the cold wind moved through the clearing for a moment, everything was still, the smoke hanging in the air, the embers rising into the dark sky, the memory of screams and ashes pressing against the hearts of those who came to speak back to the fire. He let his breath out slow and steady as he took another step forward, his boots pressing into the cold earth, the sound of the leaves beneath his feet loud in the silence, and he spoke not with words but with the crack of the rifle as it fired, the sound tearing through the night like the promise they made in the ashes. The men around the fire scrambled, reaching for their weapons, reaching for the fear they once gave to others, but he and those beside him did not stop. The neighbor fired his rifle. The woman with the knife moved like the river, quiet and unstoppable, her eyes locked on the men who took her family, her blade catching the firelight as she moved. The young boy lowered the lantern to the ground, so his small hands could lift stones to throw at the men who once laughed as they burned his home, and in that clearing the fire that was meant to destroy them became the fire that gave them strength as they moved together, as one, each of them carrying the weight of the ones they lost, each of them remembering the laughter that was stolen from them, each of them refusing to let the fear take another piece of who they were. He felt the heat of the fire on his skin as he moved through the clearing, the rifle heavy in his hands, the smoke in his lungs sharp, but he did not stop, because this was the moment they had waited for, the moment when they would no longer run, when they would no longer hide, when they would no longer bow their heads to the fear that was forced upon them. He saw the men who once carried torches now stumbling in the dirt, their faces twisted in fear as they tried to crawl away, as they tried to reach for weapons they could not hold steady, as they tried to call for help that would not come. He saw the woman with the knife kneeling beside one of the men, her blade at his throat, her eyes unblinking as she whispered to him words that only she would carry forever. He saw the neighbor with the rifle standing guard, his eyes scanning the trees, making sure that no one would escape, that no one would bring this darkness back to their home. He stood in the center of the clearing, the fire behind him, the ashes beneath his boots, the breath of the cold wind across his face, and he knew that the fire inside them had spoken, and that it would not be silenced. The dawn came slowly, painting the ashes with pale light as the cold wind moved through the clearing, and the fire burned low, leaving only embers that glowed like quiet promises in the dirt. He stood there with the rifle across his back as the woman with the knife wiped the blade on her sleeve, her eyes tired but clear. The neighbor lowered his rifle, breathing heavily as the young boy stood beside him, clutching the lantern, now empty of oil but still warm in his hands. They looked around at the men who once came with torches, now silent on the ground, their laughter gone, their cruelty gone, leaving only the memory of what they did, and the promise that it would not be allowed to happen again. He felt the weight of it in his chest as he looked at the faces of those who stood with him, each of them marked by smoke and sweat and tears, but also marked by something that would not be taken from them, something that would remain, even as the fire turned to ashes and the night turned. Today they walked through the clearing together, moving slowly between the embers, between the broken branches and the footprints that led back to their homes. The rifle heavy on his back, the knife still in the woman's hand, the lantern in the boy's grip like a piece of hope that refused to be extinguished. They did not speak because there was nothing left to say. The promise had been kept. The fire had spoken, and the fear that once held them had burned away, leaving behind only the quiet strength of those who survived. They stepped into the trees as the light grew stronger, touching the leaves with gold, touching their faces with warmth, reminding them that they were still alive, that they had something to return to, something worth protecting, something that would not be taken from them again. He felt the ground beneath his boots, the cold, damp earth that once held the footprints of men who thought themselves strong as they carried fire to destroy, but now it held the steps of those who carried fire to protect, who carried fire to speak for the ones who could not, who carried fire to remind the world that they would not be silenced. He saw the woman look back at the clearing one last time, her eyes filled with the memory of what she lost and what she found in the ashes. He saw the neighbor lift his head to the sky, taking a deep breath as the light touched his face. The young boy looked down at the lantern in his hands, and for the first time in many nights, his eyes softened and he looked up at them with the smallest hint of a smile. They moved together through the forest, back toward the fields that waited for them, back toward the homes that would be rebuilt, back toward the children who would wake with the dawn and see the faces of those who returned, not as victims but as protectors, as the fire that could not be silenced, as the promise that would be kept. They walked without fear now, because the fire had spoken, and in its light they found themselves again. They found their courage, they found their strength, they found their place in a world that tried to take everything from them and could not.